Hello and welcome to Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. Today in the studio with me, I am super excited to have Chris Donegan. Chris is a seasoned investor, advisor, and entrepreneur with a career spanning multiple industries and decades. Chris is the co-founder of Invention Capital Associates and chair of the advisory board of Calyx Venture Fund, and brings a unique perspective, blending his scientific roots as a PhD in molecular neurobiology with a rich history in business strategy and intellectual property. Recognized as one of the world's top IP strategists for over a decade, Chris has worked across tech, life sciences, media, and finance, helping companies unlock value through intangible assets. Chris brings a deep understanding of inertia, entropy, and adaptability, lessons that resonate in both personal and professional realms, and describes himself as a patchwork of the 30 most interesting people he has met. In today's episode, we talk about, are things really as bad as people think they are?
So the future, present, and I personally future is a lot more attractive than the past.
Whether which wave of innovation we're experiencing is the right one.
It shows that we're in the fourth or fifth industrial revolution, depending on which way you think about it. We had the steam, the electronic age, semiconductor age. We're the internet age, now we're in the AI age.
Whether you need to understand what a qubit is to invest in quantum computing.
Do you have to understand what a qubit is to invest in quantum computing? Do you need to understand molecular biology to invest in biotech? Not necessarily.
And how sometimes in deep tech, you have to work from the exit backwards.
What's happening is you can see a gap in the market, you can see a gap that's not being addressed. But you understand, if you do address it, where you're going with it, right? So you almost work backwards from what's successful.
Whether or not you should automate or completely redesign an industry.
The common problem is automation without really thinking about how you design something, because you now have powers.
And how to think, learn, and adapt without ego.
This ability to think, learn, adapt without ego. Just do it because you know it's the right thing.
How Chris advises that you should build a system by all means, but don't forget to stock up on the toilet paper.
They'd automated a process that didn't need to be automated, frankly. And there was no backup plan, i.e. let's have some spare toilet rolls in the cupboard.
And why Chris's nickname at school was Bubble, and whether that would happen today.
Or Bubble.
Okay.
Right. Which wasn't an offence in the bubble and squeak.
How social mobility starts in the classroom.
So how you fix social mobility, to me, starts in the classroom.
Yeah,
it starts
education.
At school. It starts at 5 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old. Because if you don't get happening then, the rest of what you do after that doesn't matter.
Let's get straight into it. This is Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah, the podcast where I talk to the people behind the stories that make the venture capital ecosystem go round. I've been working with startups from pre-seed to Series C for the last decade, and companies that I've worked with have gone on to realize value and exit, or raise funds in excess of $500 million. I really hope you enjoy the episode, and if you have a guest that you'd love to see me have on, or you have a comment on any of the episodes that I've recorded so far, do reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get straight into it. Chris, really great to have you in the studio with me today. It's been a long time coming, as I said earlier. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to dive straight in, and we're going to talk a little bit around echoes of the past, right? So given your life on this planet and some of the journeys and experiences you've had, I wanted to talk a little bit about 24 versus 1974. So how do the events and challenges this year, 2024, compare to those of 1974, where we had Vietnam, we had the IMF bailout? What are the lessons that we can draw from the past and navigate some of the complexities we're seeing in the world around us today?
Okay, so let's get one thing clear. I was 10 in 1974, right? So I'm not as old as you think or imply. It's interesting. I guess we'll talk about this a bit later as well. But 74, things were really bad. I grew up with the 3-day week, power cuts, with the winter of discontent, with the UK economy on its knees. I think inflation hit 20%, unemployment was north of 10%. Top rate of income tax for those people who are upset
75% or
was
something.
98%,
98%,
right?
yeah, okay.
Above 250,000.
Yeah,
So, you know, we're not there. We're very far from there, right? So, 2024, obviously, there's all sorts of challenges, economic, political, but we're in a different place than we were. So, the future, present, and I personally believe the future is a lot more attractive than the past. Um, but you can learn some lessons from that. There were a lot of businesses that started in the 70s. British Airways, Genentech started in
Mm.
76. There are DeLorean started mid 70s,
Okay.
which was sort of a hit and miss.
Yeah.
Um, there's never a good time to build a business. There's never a bad time. So from my standpoint, we're in a really interesting environment. Change can be viewed in two ways. It can be viewed as an absolute threat. And let's just calm down. Let's wait until things get better, and then we'll figure out what we do. Or it can be viewed as there's change happening. Let's get in front of it and let's build something. And I do really think that's where we are now. And also,
Which, sorry to interrupt, which is probably quite apparent when you think about the number of kind of political perspective, the number of incumbent kind of governments that have been given a bit of a push over the last 12 months, right? So there seems to have been a bit of a backlash against the incumbents this year. So that sort of want or desire for change may be driven by what people put in their pockets or something else, but it feels like around the world populations kind of said, actually, we like something.
so there's a theory of technological change which plots waves of innovation, Contrarian waves, and it shows that we're in the fourth or fifth industrial revolution, depending on which
Yeah.
way you think about it. We had the steam age, the electronic age, the semiconductor age, we had the internet age. Now we're in the AI age. And usually, what happens is those significant tectonic changes in technology also have big social ramifications and economic ramifications as well. And that's a place of huge turbulence, followed often by a period of relative calm as those technologies and social changes become embedded, adopted, and play out. And then you get wham, another period of change.
And we probably like the biggest platform or the biggest sort of change I think most people experience. So there was internet, and then there was mobile telephony or smartphones. That was the big platform shift, which is now 2007. We're like almost 20 years on from that, and this next platform shift seems to be AI, and predominantly again because OpenAI created a chat interface, right? Which okay, all of a sudden this technology went from being statistics, data, stuff that 90% of people on the planet are just not that interested in, to, oh, okay, there's a tool that I can chat with and speaks like a human, and therefore I can interact with it, which I certainly wasn't expecting when it happened. But like just the pace of adoption shows, just like the mobile telephone, smartphone, this is the next wave. This certainly feels like it's the next
Yeah, I mean, I think that my oldest child is 30, and he wasn't digitally native.
wave.
My youngest is 22, and she is digitally native. The behavior between those two generations is very different. And I think that not enough focus is positive focus, actually, is spent on the social impact of those technology changes. There's a lot of focus on negative aspects,
Sure.
which there are undoubtedly many. But the enablement that these technologies give, one of the big differences between now and 74 is anyone can start a business.
Yeah.
And the resources available to you can supercharge your ideas are incredible. Even from something as simple as free phone calls,
Mm.
free video, or pretty much everything is, you can be done on a cut price budget.
Mm.
If you wanted to start a business with Australia in 74, you could forget about it.
Mm.
It wasn't going to happen. Right? So I think that the social impact, and this is part of the problem with my standpoint, governance, in that I don't think very many people in positions of authority and government understand even what's possible.
Mm.
So they make plans according to
What they know.
Right? Not what they don't know.
Yeah.
And there's a generational issue in that. If you're older than 25, you have no idea what's possible. So how on earth can you direct in a period of great turbulence? So I don't know, I think that's the opportunity, actually, one of the venture community, because there are a lot of younger portfolio managers, even in their 20s now, which I think is a very good thing. And then there are a lot of slightly older ones like myself, and that's part of the fun of doing this, because you're constantly learning, and constantly playing catch up, and that I find that incredibly stimulating. And hopefully, at some point, you can bring to the party some other skills, right, that help leaven out that. Okay, I don't know this, but I do know this. How's that going to work?
I think, just to pick up on that point, when I think about businesses, one of the first things I will do is ask my daughters, right, especially if it's in a social kind of social media type business, or something that's community driven, or marketplace, or sort of online commerce, anything like that. If my daughters don't use it, then that's a pretty big signal to me, or wouldn't use it rather, than it's a pretty big signal to me that maybe it isn't necessarily as attractive as it might be being made out to. And I think your point around 30-year-old versus 22-year-old, that's not a big gap in age difference, right? 8 years. However, the difference in experience growing up is massive. So my eldest is 23, my youngest is 17, and even for them, that experience is different. So my elder daughter was already sort of 6-7 years old when the iPhone came out. My daughter was born when the iPhone came out, right? So their experience of using that technology, they're both incredibly digitally savvy, of course. But you even see today, like my younger daughter's sort of experience of and use of digital technology. It's not even native. It's just embedded in everything, right, that she does. There's just no question that she'd pick up a pen and paper, for argument's sake, or even the phone, right? Everything's obviously a message, etc. And I think your point, just going back to kind of the original premise around sort of the 70s versus today, and I think that that trope that great businesses are built in times of hardship. Yes, I think great businesses can be built in times of hardship. I think great businesses can also be built in times of abundance, as you said. I think that the difference is necessarily kind of like under what circumstances you build that businesses, and what the internal structure of that business is, right? That's what the external environment essentially forces you to do. So in a cash-strapped environment, you're going to build much more sort of scrappily and less capital. But in an abundant environment, you're potentially going to take bigger bets and look for sort of different outcomes. I certainly sit here, and I think a lot of there's been a lot of chatter online about kind of the negativity surrounding people's attitude to the UK today, and paying too much tax, or want to move to Dubai, or want to move to wherever it is. I think is very short-sighted, if nothing else, right? I certainly feel like we have challenges, but I equally, when I moved back to the UK in 2015, part of the reason for that was post 2007. For sure, for like 3, 4, 5 years post the global financial crisis, the UK didn't feel like it was in a great place. I think the kind of tipping point was around the Olympics 2012. It felt like things were improving. Now, we've had a couple of shocks since, whether that's Brexit, whether that's COVID, whatever. But actually, the UK is a pretty resilient country, has been for a long time. And yeah, to your point, things aren't as bad. Whilst I was there, I was in Papua New Guinea. Interest rates were, a good interest rate at the time was 14%. People were paying as much as 20%. The currency was in free fall when I left. All sorts of things that we're definitely not going through at the moment, right? Again, my earlier point, there are challenges, whether that's getting a mortgage if you're in your 20s, or whether you have affordability. Yes, but those are solvable problems as well. There are ways of dealing with that. But it's good to hear someone having a bit of an optimistic take, because yeah, there's definitely too much noise online about how badly things are going, and I think actually there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. I think I was at a function last week, and I can't remember now for the life of me the exact numbers, but certainly in the venture ecosystem, the UK is third largest after the US and China. That is not a bad thing. Yes, we're sort of 10x smaller than either of those, but actually, we're a country of 60 odd million people, 70 million people. We're punching way above our weight. So yeah, I think lots of reasons to be positive. I want to move on a little bit because you have, I mean, an incredibly interesting background. So, you actually, I mean, your core background was in molecular neurobiology, right? But you also have built an investment bank and you've been investing in IP-rich startups for some time. So in your mind, do investors truly grasp the complexities of what they're investing in, especially in complex fields, or do some of the more generalist approaches suffer from a lack of expertise? This is something that I think has come up a few times on the podcast, and of course, you get people saying, "Well, no, generalists can invest in specialists," and I've had people saying, "No, you need the specialist funds because certainly in things like life sciences, deep tech, etc., that skill set is required." But I'd love to get your take.
Yeah, I mean, I think that do you have to understand what a qubit is
Mm-hmm.
to invest in quantum computing?
Mm.
Um, do you need to understand molecular biology to invest in a biotech? I don't, not necessarily. Um, although there are plenty of experts, if you're not an idiot, ask, educate you a little bit about the basics. I think the area where it's really important to understand more about the technology area that you're working in is the industry dynamics, um, what the growth path looks like, what the exit paths look like, what is competitive versus not competitive. And a really good example of that would be in life sciences.
Mm.
One of my second startup was a biotech company. And when you build a biotech, unless you're truly a sort of Nobel Prize winning unicorn potential, which almost nobody is by definition, what you're essentially doing is you're building a product to the offtake of a major pharmaceutical.
Mm.
So you really need to understand what your exit market looks like as you build. And that sounds really antithetical to the notion of creativity, innovation. I've got a brilliant idea. I'm going to build it. That if I build it, they will come approach to venture building does happen, and when it is successful, it's extraordinary. But most of the time, that isn't what's happening.
Mm.
What's happening is you can see a gap in the market. You can see a gap that's not being addressed, but you understand if you do address it, where you're going with it, right? And so you almost work backwards
Yeah.
from what's successful. So I think in the deep tech areas, indeed in any of the areas, um, it's really important that you understand what that journey is going to look like, and you can't do that often if you're naive about the industry and you don't understand it. You don't know who the players are. So I think that part of it is really important. But do you need to understand molecular chemistry, mode of action? No, it's really interesting, and you could geek out as much as you want, and I love to do that. But I don't think that's necessarily going to drive that much value in your portfolio. When we built the first pharma business, which was a pain management, our initial investor, was a sort of ultra high net worth family office that made their money in steel, and their due diligence was really interesting because they didn't ask any questions about chemistry.
Science. Yep.
They asked questions like, what's the volatility of the raw materials required to manufacture your product? Because in steel, volatility is 100%.
I mean, I have a steel business in Africa.
Right.
Yeah.
And in pharma, it's really not very volatile
Yeah.
at all,
Yeah.
right? Um, we are invested in a medical device company that makes a really interesting form of catheter. And the original design used a night oil wire, which is a very unusual alloy, which is extremely expensive, extremely difficult to make. And you can have supply chain issues in manufacturing. So if you're thinking about a prototype device that works brilliantly, no problem. If you want to scale and manufacture and then sell to Medtronic or Strike, whoever, and you have a supply chain issue, they don't, you've just destroyed your valuation on exit. So I think, what I've seen is that there's some interesting questions, particularly around businesses where you're making something,
Mm.
because you've got supply chain, you've got inventory management, you've got financing issues, a whole bunch of issues. When you start, it's fine. When you get to that point where you need to scale, you suddenly realize you need a lot more money to allow you to deliver product to customer on time and
Your
so on.
working capital compound.
Yeah, and that the number of times that's missed is very high. So yeah, I think understanding the material science or the important way that entanglement works in a quantum environment, biochemical lock and key hypothesis. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I don't think it's necessary to be
So it's
successful
more,
investing in a company.
I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is it's not the technology that you necessarily need to, you need to have some understanding, presumably, because you need to know you're not being sold a lemon, as it were. But actually it's understanding the business model, the industry, the sort of typical trajectory, the sort of key issues that may arise. And from an investor perspective, and just to your point around kind of that working capital inventory management sort of side of things, obviously if you're an investor coming in, especially early, and you're investing, $750,000, whatever the number is, but in 3 years time, they're not projecting to require 5 million to scale, then something is wrong, because presumably they are going to need an injection to be able to scale. I mean, whatever the numbers are, it's understanding those dynamics that is more important, which, I mean, to be honest, I mean, certainly from a finance perspective, you can pick up those nuances irrespective of what your industry expertise. I always talk about finance being cross-disciplinary, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you've worked in a tech bio business versus a SaaS business, you can figure out how cash flows work and how a P&L should be structured. Finance is sort of, it's a blind science in the sense, right? The whole reason that accounts are the way they are and double entry works the way it does is because it's applicable across everything. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is understand the nuances of the business model and the industry, not necessarily the technology.
Yeah, but there are very distinct flavors to industry norms, the way that things work, which are very different across industries.
Well, I mean, for example, my question would then be, okay, it might be very difficult to understand quantum computing from a scientific perspective, but equally, is it possible to understand it from a business perspective or an industry perspective, because it's a nation industry?
Okay, so
right?
quantum's an interesting one because there are various issues that you need to consider very heavily that you don't necessarily in others. So regulation, almost all major quantum companies have got some national security restrictions around the use of that technology, which influences where you can sell, who your customers are, how fast you can grow, who your shareholders can be. There's this is a very sensitive, given power will be unleashed. Regulatory compliance is an area that I really like as an investor. I think it's an area where you can have a competitive advantage if you know what you're doing. If you're FDA regulated and you understand how to work with regulators and you know what that path looks like, you know what good looks like versus what not good looks like. And if you're not, then you're buying a sort of story without really understanding what the hurdles are and how challenging or easy they are. So, national security is a big one these days in some technologies, any that have any military or significant impact.
Yeah, we've had a couple of kind of dual use military investors on.
Um, from a life science standpoint, public regulatory issues are critical without that. And in the financial services industry, I think a lot of fintechs cross the line or try and cross the line to being some level of high regulation, whether it's FCA or bank license or whatever, and then that becomes a major obstacle. Revolut obviously is a really interesting case in point, where they took a very, very long time to get their banking license for all sorts of reasons. They've got it now, which is great. But I think it's very easy to underestimate. Many years ago, I interviewed for a job. It was really interesting. Chief risk officer of a very, very large, well-known fintech company. And the founder of the company said to me, Chris, I've got one question for you. What business are we in? Are we in the technology business or the banking business?
Hmm.
And I said, you're in the banking business. He said, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. We're in the technology business. I said, no, you're wrong. Because the regulator can shut you down tomorrow. And that's your biggest risk in this business. And they did run into some regulatory issues. And that company is doing extremely well today, but founders are not there anymore.
Sure.
And so I think really understanding something that perhaps is a little bit outside of your domain and having the right guidance on that it can be really important. It can also give you a huge competitive advantage.
Yeah.
As an operator.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of that, and I think this is one thing that I kind of go back and forth with, especially with edtech, funny enough, which is, I guess, where I first dipped my toes into kind of the tech sector. Sometimes the best builders in those spaces are the ones that come from outside because they see where it's broken. I remember working at Deutsche Bank, sort of systems, that were like legacy systems from 30 years ago that have been patched into systems that they bought from, some small bank in Moldova or wherever it would have been, right? And so you've got all of this sort of stuff being plumbed together, and therefore internally the way people would have thought about things was in terms of the operating system as existed, as opposed to what a clean operating system might look like. And I think with education, I saw that very similarly. You had people that looked at the education system from inside and said, okay, how do I teach better? Or, how do I deliver this in a more technologically advanced way? Versus people that came from outside the system, like, okay, how do we actually just recreate how education works? How and today the obvious example or answer potentially is, what would a virtual classroom, using XR, AR, VR, whatever, layered in with AI, layered in with, whatever the technology might be, what would that look like? How would that change, the way people think about education today? Like, could you immerse yourself in the Battle of Hastings, right, in a way that you couldn't in the past?
Yeah, I mean, the common problem is automation without really thinking about how you would redesign something, because you now have powers that you didn't have when you designed the process. And again, I think we're in a situation at the moment where we've got so many technical options to solve problems, both from an operational performance standpoint, but also from customer engagement standpoint, customer service, almost every part of the value chain inside a company at this moment in time could be rethought.
100%, yeah.
And this is a reason why innovation really works, because embedded processes, people, ways of working, incumbent market shares, and so on cannot change for all sorts of reasons at all, or either to a level which would make them competitive with a startup.
Yeah.
And that cycle of creative destruction is powered by that fractal change that happens when something new happens. You can see it with there are AI evangelists. I'm not one of them. and there are, doomsters. Well, we're all going to die. The Terminator has arrived. It's just a really clever tool.
Hmm.
So I work with an Italian partner, and I'm really, Massimo, forgive me for saying this. And he is brilliant. We've known each other for 20 odd years. But he's Italian, so when he writes English, he writes in Latin syntax.
Yeah, as does my wife.
So
Yeah.
if he sends me something to read, I know he wrote it, and he'll normally say, "Chris, can you tidy this up?"
Sure.
And recently he sent me something. He said, "What do you think?" And it was beautiful. It was absolutely perfect. And I said, I can't. Massimo, it's brilliant, right? Did you write this?
Yeah.
He said, "No, Chat GPT."
Yeah.
So the reality is that we're in a situation now where, as a startup, you really have an edge.
Yeah.
And I think identifying the founders and companies that are nimble and adept at really rethinking the way that they go. Another good example: we're invested in a fantastic fertility company run by one of the most dynamic founders that I've come across, Tess. And she has built the product that we're going to market with. And the moment the product was ready to go to market, completely refigured the organization. We're no longer a product development organization. We're now a sales
organization.
And restructured her entire organization within 2 months of reaching that first milestone. It's a very difficult thing.
Very abnormal.
Because it requires you to let some people go, bring on some new people, rethink the go-to-market strategy, and so on. And
Well, you're changing the objective.
And that, that ability to tack from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, but then use technology and use everything you've learned in the first part of the journey to make the second part different. That's as an established organization, you can't do that. Right? So I think the best founders that are creative, adaptive, and autodidactic, right? Everyone talks about resilience, which obviously is critical because it's a complete nightmare. Trying to build something from nothing. Yes, grit to me is like number one foundation, but this ability to think, learn, adapt without ego, just do it because it's the right thing.
So let's talk about founders in that case, because I think you're starting to touch on some stuff that's pretty interesting. I mean, how do you think about this kind of paradox of being a misfit when you're building something, kind of, but equally the necessity of fitting in to scale it, right? So you've got to be kind of slightly out there to start building it, but you've got to be slightly in there to kind of continue to grow it. How do you think about balancing those forces?
So I think you do have to have an extraordinarily robust ego belief system to start something because it's crazy. Chances of success are minuscule, and probably almost everyone around you, unless you're in a particular environment where everyone's a startup, is going to tell you that you're crazy. Shortly after you start, you'll start to realize you are crazy because it's really hard, right? So I think the self-drive, confidence, mission, that it takes to start something is unusual. Is that being a misfit?
It's certainly not being satisfied with the status quo.
Yeah, and I think it comes from different places. I started my first business when I was 30, something like that, maybe 32. And I'd had 12 years of proper work behind me. And frankly, I'd had enough of it and wanted to do something where I could actually make the rules.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that.
And the funny thing is that you learn quite quickly on, you can't make the rules, actually. There are a set of other rules that you've got to learn.
You're always working for someone, right? Even if you're not working
for
it's
someone. your investors or your board or your staff or your customers or what have you. So there's no freedom unless you want to be a poet. And even then, someone's got to buy your poetry. So not being independently wealthy is requires you to do that. So I do think you have people come to being an entrepreneur because they've got that mission.
Mm.
They want to change the world. They're going to do it um, because it's an accident. I wrote an article a couple of years ago on the accidental made redundant, started something which turned out to be actually a business. You didn't even think it was going to be a business, and it became one.
It's kind of the emergent strategy approach, which I think is like how I've approached practically.
And that requires a sort of opportunistic mindset, right? And I think all good founders have got an opportunistic mindset too. Even if you've got a core mission, to be able to spot the real opportunity as you're going through. Okay, that's where I should be going, and to have the self-confidence and the willingness and the adaptability to take that fork in the road because that's where you're going to go. I think that's part of it. But it's often said that what got me here isn't going to get me there. And I do think you reach a sort of stage where energy, craziness, the tunnel vision to get to a certain point, at some point can become an impediment. And you need to change your mindset a bit, build a team. You need to do something different.
The, the, the way I always talk about it, and some other guests I've had on the podcast, is like, if you think about what a business is, a business is actually a set of processes, replicable processes, right? And at startup, it's all about discovery. It's all about experimentation. Processes actually, you have smaller processes, but for the most part, you're just out there in the world trying stuff out. Whereas when you're scaling or when you're growing a business, those processes, those guardrails actually tell your team how to operate, when to operate, with whom, why, and actually allow them to be creative within those boundaries, which helps the business scale. But it also means that someone else coming to the business can just pick up those processes. That's an acquirer, whether that's a new employee, whatever, can pick up those processes and run with them. I know at a personal level, like I fight against process sort of structure.
Yeah, because a lot of entrepreneurs resist process because that's why they're an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I was doing some work as an advisor to a co-working, not we, and it was a really interesting business. Great people. They incubated a lot of very successful companies, and they had a control software that controlled pretty much everything that was going on in buildings. And I can remember that my first day standing there talking to the CEO, and one of the facilities managers came up. We have an issue, and it was really a simple issue. There was no toilet paper in the toilets. It was a problem because there were actually clients in the toilet who were trapped in the toilet. They didn't have any, and the building control system had some sort of lag ordering, and the CTO came and said, "We're going to fix that problem." Started sort of coding, and I said, "What you really should have is someone go down to the supermarket right now and buy some toilet paper." Right? And they'd automated a process that didn't need to be automated, frankly, and there was no backup plan. I.e., let's have some spare toilet rolls in the cupboard. And I know this is a ridiculous example to give,
but it's very true.
But I just couldn't. I was completely dumbfounded. I said, "Look, I'll go. As my first task for you, I'm going to go down the road and buy some toilet paper and deliver it. Throw it over the stalls, sort of thing." And I think about that a lot when I look at some of our businesses, because part of the problem with podcasts and so on is that people starting a business think that there's a blueprint, because everyone's telling them there's a blueprint.
Yeah, and that's the massive problem. Like, and we were talking about this earlier. You go online, everyone is telling you, just do this one thing and you'll be done. It's like, well, no, you did that one thing and it happened to work because of the circumstances, potentially the organization, luck, let's face it, the environment, and the business proposition that you had, and it worked. It doesn't mean that that's a cookie cutter approach.
Yeah, so my sort of shortcut way to describe that would be, by all means, build a system, but have some toilet rolls in the cupboard. That would be my way of explaining it.
I love that. I am just now thinking whether there's any. Well, I don't know. You visited the bathroom here. I won't ask you whether there's toilet rolls. Look, we're gonna switch tack a little bit because this is another topic that I know you and I have chatted about quite a lot, and that sort of social mobility and kind of the migrant experience. So you come from a migrant family background. Your wife and you both come from quite sort of interesting and diverse backgrounds, and those will have influenced and shaped your views on social mobility. So I'd love to understand how those views have been shaped, and then also kind of what the role of adaptability is in overcoming inertia and entropy in how you think about personal and professional growth.
Okay, I mean it's a very topical, subject matter. I mean where I grew up, everybody was. So, my father came from Cyprus, late 50s. My mother's family came from Ukraine.
Oh,
My wife's family came from Italy, World War II. We grew up in our neighborhood. It was Greeks, Italians, Jews, Jamaicans.
was this in London?
This was in Kent,
And
Thanet, the Isle of Thanet in
oh,
Kent.
Thanet. Okay, yeah.
My wife's from Margate.
I would have not have expected it to have been as
Yeah,
diverse as that.
very diverse. It was a stopping off point. I'm from Ramsgate, which is an old fishing town. And so it wasn't weird if you had a funny name. I changed my name when my mum got remarried, but my name at school was Eleftherio, Greek Cypriot name.
I've always wanted to ask you that, but I didn't know
Yeah.
how to broach it. Okay, fine. Now I
Christakis
know.
Marios Eleftherio was my name at school, right, which was a really sort of odd name,
Yeah.
not John Smith. So, but there were a lot of other strangely named children as well, right? So
But the real question is, A, what did your mates call you? And B, what did your teachers
Chris
Yeah.
or Bubble,
call you? Okay.
right,
Interesting.
was which wasn't an offence in those days.
Yeah.
Bubble and Squeak.
Yeah.
So that in a way that was normal, right?
Well, sorry, just to interrupt for a second. You say Bubble and Squeak wasn't an offense in those days. It is incredible how far we've come, because that probably would be offensive today.
Well, it's incredible in two ways, right? The
Yeah.
first is it might be deemed to be offensive, but the second is it truly was a much more hostile environment.
Interesting.
On a Saturday night, it was dangerous because there were skinheads, there was the National Front, there was, wherever you get a reasonably large immigrant community, there's a counter
Opposition
force,
to
right?
it, yeah,
And some of the things that would have happened absolutely would not happen in a million years. So what I see is a social progression that's very dramatic, very, very dramatic, in a positive sense. Right? Still got lots of issues, but things are very different.
We don't live in utopia.
Things are very different in the way they used to be, both in terms of racism and misogyny. Actually, I've been watching a TV show, a very old BBC TV show that I missed the first time it came around, Ashes to Ashes, which is a TV show where a police officer gets shot in the head and is in a coma and lives a sort of parallel life back in 1974 and then 1984. And so you're living in 1974, and it's brilliantly done. And the level of racism, misogyny that's just normalized because that's what it was like then.
Yeah.
Zero. It does not exist today. So I'm not saying today is great, but there's all sorts of problems. But tying it into that earlier question, so where we grew up, yeah, it was pretty multicultural, but there were quite a lot of issues to deal with. Secondary modern school, we had the 11 plus, didn't pass it. Late developer is what they call. And actually, I can remember going to see my careers master at my secondary school 15, and they asked me what I wanted to do. I said I was going to become a doctor, and they laughed. They literally were laughing, and you can't even imagine. They started laughing. I said, no, you should pick something else.
Plumber.
Right?
Yeah.
That level of stupidity it really outrages me now.
Yeah.
So and tie it into this notion of social mobility, my mother had 3 jobs when I was growing up. She was a croupier in a casino. She used to deal blackjack and became a gaming inspector. She used to swim with dolphins and killer whales in an aquarium, right? And throw fish and jump in. So, and then she became a laboratory technician in a school. Very adaptable, very diverse, clever lady, who just sort of figured out how to do different things to earn a living. So we grew up as children, and with this sort of role model of someone that was very adaptable and always learning new things, and encouraged us to do that. And I think I was endlessly curious and wildly voracious reader. Read everything. Public library was amazing.
Don't think my kids have ever.
Right. And maybe you don't need to have a public library these days because you have everything on a phone or it's available to you. For me, that window on knowledge and information, springboard to firstly understanding that there were other things in the world to do than the things that were in front of me, and being aware they existed, and also hearing different voices through words, through the printed word, that gave me sort of inspiration, gave me guidance, gave me support, and so on. There was a LinkedIn post that I was responding to this week on the topic, which is my community of influencers were mostly writers. And it's really interesting because my oldest, who's a doctor, his community of influencers were mostly podcasters.
Yeah.
Right, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
To me that's happened. So I think thinking about social mobility, I saw around me when I was at school immense talent where there was really no encouragement to step out of a particular niche that you'd been put in,
or even outlet.
Right. There was limited access, but the access that did exist was books, library, and we had a good library, a good library to go to. And cultural. Was it acceptable to be good at school? If you weren't good at sports and you were just good at school, that was a problem.
That was a problem. Right? Yeah.
So how you fix social mobility to me starts in the classroom.
Yeah,
it starts
education.
At school. It starts at 5 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old. Because if you don't get happy then, the rest of what you do after that doesn't matter. It's really hard to change those hard-coded mental pathways, those attitudes. It can be done, but it begins at school, and it with that level of support. And in some ways, the resources that children have available today are infinitely superior.
But actually,
there's a lack of curation.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so there's lack of curation, but there's also the information availability is so immense. You have sort of analysis paralysis, right? There's just too much out there. So talk for hours, I'm sure, about what can you trust, what don't you trust. Podcasts are really interesting. My daughter, for example, listens to lots of them, and I kind of, she comes out with some views, and I'm like, not entirely sure about that. Well, no, this person on the podcast said it. I was like, well, maybe you want to go back and check and verify. And I think that's why today we're in the place we are with a lot of social media. And again, you and I talked about this before the show, where it's very easy to seek out the information that you want to seek out, that plays into your biases or your opinions already, right? Versus finding broader, more thoughtful and balanced views. And I think the great thing about long form writing and indie books, right? So books that stand the test of time, is typically that they do tend to recognize their own omissions and failures and other viewpoints, because they're long form. They've got to fill, 50 chapters or whatever it is. And therefore you grow up with a much more balanced sort of view than necessarily what we're seeing at the moment, which is a lot of kind of extremism is an extreme word, but extremism or polarity.
But sometimes there's that famous saying, the medium is the message. Mm. And I think one of the challenges with social media is that soundbite is really effective.
Yeah.
But many ideas are too complicated to put into a soundbite. Right? And
I mean, the purpose of this podcast is to curate as many 1-minute clips as we can. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, no, but that is the reality.
Yeah, sure.
And the reverse has been said, which is that if you can, the point of Twitter originally was that if you're really good, then you can condense something worth saying
into 280
words, and that's actually a skill and talent in itself.
Well, it was 140 that went to 280, and now though that whole premise has been sort of thrown to the side because you can buy the blue check and write essays
as much as you want.
Yeah.
Right? So Substack's good because everyone gets a voice. Then you get this curation problem again.
Yeah.
So I think for me the key is be curious, be egoless, hold strong opinions weekly.
Yeah.
Be prepared to change them. And if you go in with that attitude, you might learn something.
Yeah.
Some of my best teachers in the last 10 years have been my children because they'll challenge me with their ideas, and even because I love them, I am obliged to listen to them.
Yeah, I had similar experience.
And I suddenly will think, you know what?
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought about it.
Yeah.
And I just think that's, but now everyone's in that position. They don't have that challenge. So there's a very, very good organization called Speakers for Schools, and it's a charity. Andrew Law, who's the president at Caxton, the hedge fund, its largest benefactor. But it's an organization that started sending notable people into schools, quite often deprived schools, and so on, and just talking to them. And they've had big guys like Bill Gates go in, and then just people like, who am I? Where did I come from? How come I'm sitting behind a microphone now and you're not? And that's another sort of side to it, which is not just sharing information and ideas, but actually presenting a physical human, and who isn't like outside of the Bill Gates.
Not a construct, not an image that.
It might even be attainable.
Yeah.
That's interesting, right? Actually, it's one of the reasons that attracted me to Black Bullion in the first place when we invested, because they're dealing with university students and maybe even the 2 years prior to that, and trying to get them to think about life skills. And one of the most important life skills, as you all know, Aarish, because of your background, is finance, right? And
I mean, I met Vivi in 2016, and she's like, "Yeah, I'm educating university students on how to manage their budgets." I'm like, "Bloody hell, that's that's probably quite needed."
So my middle son is getting married next year. A few years ago, he said to me, Dad, he said, "I'd like to understand where all the money goes."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, what do you want to know?" And he said, "I want to know what our budget looks like, family." So I talked him through the budget, and at the end of it, he said, "We spent a lot of money."
my daughter did exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Right. So
anyway, and of course, I blame my wife. But anyway.
This, if you go back to the question around social mobility, it's you need to have your horizons opened up so that you actually think, oh, well, actually, a lot of things are possible. Then you need to understand if I wanted to do something, how would I do it?
Yeah.
Access to some guidance and some mentoring, whether it's via a human being or whether it's, in my case, via a book. Because I didn't have any mentors, right? I had a book. And then, if you do get into the world, the other thing that has happened to me, and I know we talked about it previously, is, I was just very lucky to have some bosses and co-workers that were fabulous teachers. And even to this day, my first boss, my first job, Mark, and I still have lunch at least once or twice a year.
Lovely.
And I just learned so much.
Yeah.
And as I've gone through, that started as an accident. It became a deliberate thing.
Yeah.
What can I learn from who?
Yeah.
Let's go learn it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's amazing. Again, I mean, you and I both know, Chris, we could be here for hours if we wanted to. I have high hopes for this final question. I'm going to ask you to keep it maybe a little bit short, but we've for context, I asked this question to all guests, or have been for the last few months, and I have yet to hear an answer Well, often I guess we'll say we can't answer that. And other times I just wonder how pre-prepared they are. So what is one thing that you have a contrarian opinion or conviction about from any area of life? So whether that's work, politics, socially, home, what is a hill that you would die on defending?
So that's two different questions.
Yeah, I know.
Way.
Well, there we go. That was the first contrarian.
So I think my contrarian point of view is that the world is much better shape than
is in better shape.
Is in better.
Okay. Yeah.
We have access to much more information. We see a lot more things. Most of what we see is terrible and depressing, but actually, what you don't see is the other side of that, which is that go back to 1974, come back here.
Yeah.
Seriously, I would rather
when
live
would you
now
rather
than
live?
then.
Yeah.
So contrary to 90% of what you see, the world is in a much better place. The hill that I would die on is probably free speech. I believe that the only way you can build a successful society for everybody is through a secular, free speech, sort of equality type society, and where everyone can have their point of view, but everyone has to just get along.
Yeah.
Right? And that means one set of rules for everybody. You can say whatever you like. Frankly, you can say whatever you like. We're sort of in an environment where that's being challenged for good reasons, and it's been challenged for bad reasons. And unfortunately, there isn't whether you limit free speech because some people are saying things you don't like, or whether you limit free speech because you think that not everyone should hear certain things, only certain people should hear certain things. You free speech is allowed, but only in closed rooms.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I just think it's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
So that is probably the hill I would die.
I think that's a hill many of us would probably die on as well. Chris, it's been absolutely incredible having you in the studio today. For the audience, where can they find you online? You're on LinkedIn, Twitter. Where is the best place to find you?
Probably I spend far too much time on LinkedIn.
Yeah, as do I.
And I've normally have an X or Twitter account, but I never use it unless LinkedIn posts my post there. So that's it really. I'm not, oddly, social media. I started on LinkedIn. It's funny actually, diverse, but I started as an observer for about 2 or 3 years, never said a word, just watched. Then I spent probably 4 or 5 years posting very technical information on my particular area of expertise. And then over the last, 5 to 10 years, I've just been diving into all sorts of interesting things and learning a lot, actually. I mean, people say negative things about social media. I have met some really fantastic.
Well, you and I met there, so it can't have been half bad.
Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.